This is my third time in Waterloo for the Tragos Fez Hall of Fame. I enjoyed my two previous visits, and I'm truly honored to be standing up on this stage and receiving the Jim Melby Award. Thank you to Chad Olson, Troy Peterson, Becca Roper, Jim Miller, Mike Doty, Dan Gable, Gerald Briscoe, Conrad Thompson, James Beard, Gloria Lovell, and everyone involved with the museum and the Hall of Fame. Looking at the other people who have received this award, it's somewhat intimidating. Virtually all of them have been historians for much, much longer than I. I think what people appreciate about my work is that I often take a very different approach to being an historian than others. I don't just compile records from the past, I try to do something with them to give them context, to turn two-dimensional newspaper ads and articles into something more tangible, a third dimension. So much of wrestling history focuses on the biggest stars, largest venues. We know lots about Bruno, Flair, Thunderbolt, Madison Square Garden, the Cow Palace, Cobo Arena. But a big part of why Charting the Territories exists is because I wanted to share information not just about those superstars, but about all the people whose job title was professional wrestler. I wanted to share information about the Bull Barn in Hereford, Texas, the East Park Recreation Center in Houma, Louisiana, the Grand Theater in Salem, Oregon, hundreds of other venues where thousands of wrestlers plied their trade night after night, year after year. Historians such as myself have done an incredible job of filling in the blanks, tracking the who, what, when, where, and why of professional wrestling. We've uncovered thousands of previously undocumented shows in smaller venues and towns, and presented a much clearer picture of what life was like for not just the superstars, but every pro wrestler. Take Rock Riddle, for example. Please. Right there. For years, I thought he was just a guy that wrestled briefly before becoming an international male model or whatever it is that ridiculously good-looking people do with their lives. But his wrestling career was more substantial than that. While our records are still very incomplete, we've documented 516 matches of Rock's dating back to his debut in 1972. And according to those records, he has won 3 of them. Researching the history of wrestling is often difficult. You see, some of these wrestlers and promoters like to, let's just say, embellish. So getting to the truth is sometimes difficult. Even the nicknames they use were often not true. I mean, they all claim to be ravishing or sexy boys or macho men. Some of the names they use rang true. Andre the Giant was a giant. AJ Styles was, and still is, phenomenal. And if you've ever seen photos of a young Jimmy Valiant, that man was handsome. Later in his career, well, I'll just leave that up to you. But most of these wrestlers' nicknames didn't pass the sniff test. Baron von Raschke, not a baron. The Mummy, not a mummy. The Young Bucks, not so young anymore. Same goes for the Hardy Boys. Kamala the Ugandan headhunter. Neither Ugandan nor skilled in the art of hunting heads. The Rock. Of course, Dwayne Johnson was not an inanimate object that sat in the ring doing nothing for minutes at a time. That was Larry Zbyszko. and by the way, if one of these guys comes up and knocks me out, we have no need to fear because Dr. Tom Pritchard will come give me treatment. But that might not be a good thing because Dr. Tom Pritchard knows zip about medicine. Both names. See what I did there? He's going to snatch me afterwards. And if they couldn't come up with an exaggerated nickname for themselves, they'd borrow someone else's. From Buddy Rogers to Roger Kirby to Ric Flair to Buddy Landell to Paul Lee, there are a lot of nature boys. And they wouldn't just borrow the nicknames, they'd borrow each other's moves or even their gimmicks. Just recently on my podcast, we talked about how Ivan Putski borrowed a lot of his early character from the Mighty Igor. But that's not the only time someone stole the Mighty Igor's gimmick. You see, he used to come to the ring waving a giant kielbasa around, a gimmick that was stolen in later years by Ron Fuller. If you've seen that pic of him in the Speedo, you know what I'm talking about. Now, as fans, we want to hear the outrageous, humorous stories these wrestlers tell about life in such a unique business. And honestly, whether they're true or not, we still enjoy hearing them, because these men are some of the greatest storytellers you will ever meet. But they're more than that. They're three-dimensional people. Prior to becoming an historian, I worked as a manager in independent wrestling for many years. And one of the first people I met was Bo James. Now, you look at the two of us, me, a nice Jewish kid from New York, Bo, a gruff, rough, and tough man from Fall Branch, Tennessee. Besides pro wrestling, it sure looks like we have absolutely nothing in common. But as we spent time together, we found common ground. He loved the TV show Seinfeld. I got into the Southern rock he would listen to, Marshall Tucker Band, Blackfoot, and he'd even let me control the radio once in a blue moon. And he tolerated my musical choices. Though I think deep down inside, Bo, you like Alanis Morissette a lot more than you might want to admit. And it's important to learn about the real people behind the pro wrestlers, that third dimension. Weekends like this in Waterloo are a great opportunity to do so, because so many of the wrestlers here are so approachable all weekend. And even if you think you have nothing in common with them aside from wrestling, or even the other fans who are here as well, if you spend the time to get to know the wrestlers and the other fans, you might find you have more in common than you think. Just today, I was talking to Zach Takis. Zach is a fan and a podcaster. He hosts the Shotgun Wrestling Radio podcast, and every year he has some folks on the podcast to promote Tragos Thets. He's been doing this podcast since 2010, and he started it with a good friend of his who was also named Zach. So two guys, both named Zach, both wrestling fans, but here's the kicker. One is a Cubs fan, the other a Cardinals fan. Now, in some places, them's fighting words, but it's not about our differences. It's about what we all have in common. And the history of wrestling is not just about who beat who held this title, how many fans showed up. It's about people. People from all walks of life, people you think you may not have much in common with outside of wrestling, but in all likelihood, you probably do. So the co-host of my podcast, Charting the Territories, John Boucher, is someone that I do have quite a bit in common with. And fortunately, at one point last night, we were worried that we were about to become the subject of a future episode of Dark Side of the Ring. Chad hiding behind the curtain, and I think we all know why. But the reason John and I have so much in common is why I asked him to co-host the podcast with me. We hadn't actually spoken prior to 2020, but from following him online, I knew we were about the same age, both originally from the Northeast. We had similar tastes, not just in wrestling, but also in baseball and in music. And a huge reason that more than just a handful of people have even heard of Charting the Territories, and a big part of why I'm up here, is due to John. Without him, my podcast would be me rattling off numbers and statistics and charts and graphs. But he added color to it. His knowledge of wrestling and the offbeat stories and his passion for finding more is what gave Charting the Territories that third dimension. So I want to give a huge thank you to John and Bo James and Chad Olson and Gerald Briscoe, along with a few other wrestling historians who aren't here that helped, supported, and guided me along the way. Larry Goodman, the late Dan Paris, Barry Rose, Chris Zellner and David Bixenspan, Jonathan Snowden, Chris Harrington and Brandon Thurston, Chris Knights, Brian Last, Jess McGrath, and David Gibb. But I also want to thank two of the previous Melby Award winners who are here tonight, Steve Johnson and Tom Burke, as well as other past winners, Greg Oliver, Scott Teal, and Dick Bourne, all of whom didn't brush me aside when I would email them and say, hey, I've got this wacky theory. Instead, they helped me and showed me how to find the resources to prove or disprove my theories, most of which were indeed wacky, many of which ended up not being true, and one or two of which actually did pan out. I'm so happy to have met so many of you over the last couple of days. I want to thank my mother. Let me rephrase that. I have to thank my mother. You gotta. For 10 of the first 12 years of my life, she raised me as a single parent. She worked as a school librarian, so my abilities as a researcher and an historian probably come from her. And she was so excited when I told her back in December that I was going to receive this award. I hadn't even told her when the ceremony was, but she said she was going to be there. And then I told her it was in Iowa in July. And she looked at me and said, oh, I'm busy that weekend. So she is not here in person, but she is here in spirit. And all of you who are here in person, I am so happy to have met so many of you, and I am honored to accept the 2024 Jim Melby Award. Thank you.
Yeah!